Welcome, and let's dive right in. When we talk about extreme wealth, high finance, the stories often focus on the genius, maybe the sheer audacity of the people involved.
Right, the sort of great man theory of wealth creation.
Exactly. But today's deep dive, we're going beyond that. We're looking at a world where these huge fortunes are built not just on clever ideas, but on, well, relentless control, really strategic disruption, and sometimes a willingness to push right up against the edge.
Or maybe even step over it.
Maybe even step over it, yeah. The ethical lines, the legal boundaries.
Precisely. And we've pulled together a really fascinating set of sources that give this incredible panoramic view of power, of capital, across centuries,
So
actually.
not just the modern tech giants.
Oh, no. We're talking the original tycoons like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, then tracking it through Wall Street in the, say, late 20th century, the LBO boom, right up to the digital behemoths we see today. And the mission here really is to uncover the common playbook, the hidden operating rules, if you like, for the super rich. What do they hide? How do they dominate? And crucially, what's the real cost to society when wealth gets this concentrated?
Okay, so let's unpack that. This architecture of audacity, as we're calling it. We're tracing how wealth gets built, how markets get deliberately disrupted, maybe even engineered.
Yeah, engineered's a good word for it sometimes.
And just how far some people will go to grab power and keep it, whether that's, through consolidating whole industries or leveraging absolutely insane amounts of debt.
That would sink any normal company, yeah.
Right. Or even just making sure there's no email trail, no electronic breadcrumbs left behind for a courtroom later on. It feels like a playbook that's been refined over generations.
It absolutely has. The tools change, maybe, but the underlying principles, they seem remarkably consistent.
So let's start with technology. Right now, it feels like the most powerful engine for creating just immense wealth, sometimes almost overnight.
It certainly is. But the sources we looked at show that the path to dominance, especially digital dominance, it's rarely straightforward. It takes some serious strategic thinking.
Okay, so where do we begin? How do these innovation spaces actually evolve? And how do these digital monopolies end up reshaping the whole global economy?
Well, it's really fascinating to look at how different systems like the U.S. and China tackled a breakthrough tech like deep learning, the foundation of modern AI.
Right.
The initial timeline itself tells a story. The fundamental breakthroughs in deep learning that mostly happened in the U.S., Canada, the U.K., years before China really got into the game seriously.
How far behind are we talking? Because in tech, like you said, a year can feel like forever.
Well, the research suggests China didn't really have its wake-up moment,
Yeah.
what some called its Sputnik moment for AI,
Mhm.
until around 2016.
2016.
Wow. Yeah. So a full decade after the first key academic papers really shifted the field and launched the whole deep learning era, that decade lag, it created this immense pressure to catch up fast. And they did it with a very specific commercial strategy.
And that strategy, the sources mentioned this idea of copycats, which, sounds a bit negative, but apparently it was incredibly effective.
It was maybe a necessary phase. The Chinese model, initially at least, it embraced these copycats. They weren't necessarily doing original research right away, but they were masters at operationalizing ideas that already existed.
How did that work in practice?
They learned the nuts and bolts, UI design, website architecture, software development,
Right.
by basically cloning existing products, often Western ones. Now, sometimes this led to, frankly, pretty embarrassing knockoffs early on.
Right.
But it served a really vital purpose. It forced these market-driven entrepreneurs to immediately wrestle with two things: user satisfaction and really rapid iteration.
Because they weren't just competing with Silicon Valley anymore.
Exactly. They had to beat the Silicon Valley original and hordes of other local copycats doing the exact same thing. It created this hyper-competitive domestic environment,
Okay.
which forced them to localize like crazy, iterate on features constantly, improve the user experience relentlessly until they actually developed genuinely world-class products tailored specifically for the Chinese market. It was like Darwinian evolution, but, supercharged by cloning.
Now, the Western narrative often points to the Chinese government's role, the massive state funding, and the critique is usually that this kind of intervention is inefficient, right?
Yeah.
Compared to a purely free market approach.
And that view, the sources argue, kind of misses the strategic point. Yes, pouring massive amounts of capital into high-risk sectors can definitely be inefficient in the short run. There's waste.
Sure.
But the long-term goal, it was profoundly strategic. The government saw the upside as just monumental. They were aiming to engineer a fundamental shift really quickly from an economy led by manufacturing to one driven by innovation and tech.
So the thinking was basically, we'll accept some short-term inefficiency, maybe even overpay, because speed is paramount. We need to make this structural shift happen now.
Precisely. If you're trying to rewire the engine of your entire national economy and you're already a decade behind in a field as critical as AI, speed matters more than short-term efficiency. They were willing to accept the waste to engineer that long-term dominance. Hashtag be digital giants, cannibalization, and the inequality price tag.
Okay, let's connect that global race then to the playbook for digital success within the US, because this is where it gets really interesting, right? This modern dominance seems built on extreme risk, this idea of self-disruption, and almost this messianic belief in the future. You think of Jeff Bezos at Amazon.
No, absolutely. Bezos' confidence, especially back in the early 2000s when Amazon was still mostly seen as just selling books online, it was staggering.
Right.
He just sprinted forward because he truly believed the company was massively undervalued. He kept saying things like, the world just doesn't understand what Amazon is going to be.
But what was it going to be? Why didn't people get it? What was he seeing?
Well, the world saw books and CDs, maybe DVDs. Bezos saw infrastructure. He saw a marketplace. He saw scale. And that confidence led to these huge, rapid build-outs. But, not always perfectly executed.
Like the distribution centers.
Exactly. There's the famous example where during a huge expansion phase, they built 5 brand new state-of-the-art distribution centers, only to realize pretty quickly they'd overshot. They had to close 2 of them almost immediately, lay off hundreds of people in the correction.
Wow.
But the key is the failure, the inefficiency. It was almost baked into the process.
Yeah.
Speed was more important than perfection.
And the big lesson he seemed to take from that whole period wasn't be more cautious. It was about needing to destroy your own business line sometimes, this idea of cannibalizing yourself.
Absolutely. That became a core philosophy.
Yeah.
And it was really driven home by watching what happened with the music industry, right? The iPod just it eviscerated, as the sources say, the physical CD business.
Yeah.
Bezos saw that happen to legacy players and decided Amazon couldn't afford to be caught flat-footed like that.
Right.
So the mantra became, it is far better to cannibalize yourself than have someone else do it.
And the comparison to Kodak really drives that home, doesn't it?
Oh, it's the perfect cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Kodak, this giant of photography for a century, their own engineers actually invented the first digital camera back in the 70s.
No way.
Yeah. But the executives just couldn't bring themselves to pivot. Why? Because it would have risked their incredibly profitable film and chemical business for this uncertain, probably less profitable digital future.
And Bezos did the opposite with ebooks.
Exactly. He forced Amazon to own the ebook market, even though it directly competed with their hugely successful physical book sales. Why? Because control over the future platform, even if it cost them revenue now, was everything. He wouldn't be Kodak.
But this aggressive innovation, especially now with AI starting to permeate everything, it's driving this massive concentration of wealth, right? The sources point to a pretty stark inequality price tag.
They do, and it's a really critical point about where things might be heading. On the one hand, AI monopolies can drive down consumer prices, make things cheaper. That's the potential upside for us.
Okay.
But corporate profits, they could explode. And that wealth gets concentrated among, the elite executives, the VCs funding it all, and the core engineers who actually build and control these powerful algorithms.
And the impact on jobs on the labor market is potentially pretty bleak, this idea of a bifurcated structure.
Exactly. The forecast is that the labor market could split into 2 main groups. On one side, you've got the really lucrative work for the top performers, the CEOs, the AI architects, the specialized consultants, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And on the other side, you have a large number of low-paying jobs, often physically demanding or emotionally draining, in sectors that are just hard to automate completely.
Yeah.
The sources use these really stark pairings like CEOs and healthcare aides, or venture capitalists and masseuses.
It seems almost backwards. Why are those specific low-end jobs safe, relatively speaking, and why does the high-end capture so much value?
Well, the value gets placed on the intellectual capital that controls the AI, not necessarily the labor it replaces. Those low-paying jobs, like caring for the elderly or maybe complex physical therapy, they require things like human empathy, dealing with unpredictable environments, fine motor skills, stuff that current AI struggles to replicate cheaply and effectively.
Right.
The high-paying jobs are so lucrative because those individuals manage these incredibly productive, capital-intensive AI systems. Just imagine, how much more profitable Uber becomes if it has zero drivers paying for cars and gas.
Or Amazon with way fewer warehouse workers because of robots.
Exactly. The productivity gains are enormous, but those gains flow directly to the owners and the engineers of the tech, not to the workers who might have been displaced.
Okay, let's rewind a bit then to the pioneers who kind of established this culture of digital dominance in the first place. The early days of personal computing, I mean, they were clearly shaped by some really aggressive personalities, driving hard to set the standards.
Oh, absolutely. These folks had this relentless competitive drive. Sometimes, well, bordering on confrontational. Take Bill Gates, obviously brilliant, but notoriously impatient, especially with people he felt weren't keeping up.
Yeah, I've heard stories.
His science teacher apparently once said Gates always seemed like he was on the verge of saying, "But that's obvious," which, tends to shut down conversation.
And he had this reputation for finding flaws in systems too, right?
He did. Even as a kid, he was known for breaking into computer security systems.
Yeah.
The sources talk about this one-liner bug he found, basically a short piece of code that could crash or take over a system. It showed his technical skills, sure, but also this mindset of finding and exploiting weaknesses. That carried over into business.
And that impatience, that style, it apparently caused real friction, even with crucial early partners.
Yeah, it led to a pretty famous falling out with Ed Roberts, the founder of amass, the company that made the Altair, the computer Microsoft wrote its first software for.
Right.
Roberts apparently found Gates really difficult. Respected his technical chops, of course, but ended up calling him a spoiled kid. He actually felt Paul Allen was much more creative, while Gates, he thought, sometimes seemed more interested in arguing than collaborating.
But whatever his style, Gates was absolutely laser-focused on market control.
Totally. His priority was making Microsoft's interface manager, which, became Windows the absolute standard for the IBM PC world. It was a classic standards war.
Trying to lock in all those DOS users.
Exactly. Shift them all over Microsoft applications. And he was so determined to stake that claim that he apparently resorted to some pretty aggressive marketing tactics, like hinting to the press that products were ready weeks before they even had a working prototype.
That sounds like it could backfire.
It did sometimes, yeah. It embarrassed the company later when deadlines slipped. But crucially, in the short term, it helped cement Microsoft's image as the one setting the standard. That psychological positioning was key.
Speaking of aggressive tactics and strategic compromises, Steve Jobs wasn't immune either, right? He had to make calls that went against his sort of pure Apple vision to maintain control.
Oh, the iTunes for Windows decision is the perfect example of that. Initially, Jobs fought it tooth and nail. He wanted to keep the Apple ecosystem pure, lock people into Macs.
Made sense from his perspective.
Sure. But he eventually realized the bigger risk was actually losing control over the user experience entirely.
How so?
He saw that letting some other company, like Music Match back then, handle the digital music experience for the huge Windows user base, potentially with what he considered crappy software. Well, that's the worst outcome. It would degrade the whole digital music revolution Apple was trying to lead.
So releasing iTunes for Windows was a form of self-cannibalization, too, giving up platform exclusivity.
Exactly. He sacrificed that exclusivity, but in return, Apple kept control over that critical user experience. It ensured Apple's standard, and therefore Apple's dominance, in the digital music space, even on competing platforms. It was a very shrewd, if painful, strategic move.
Okay, let's shift gears now. From the architecture of digital dominance to the architecture of finance. The more traditional battlegrounds, maybe. Where fortunes get built on, well, mountains of debt, insider knowledge, and market mechanics that often feel ethically flexible, let's say.
Ethically elastic might be a good term.
Sure.
Yeah, this is a world defined by extreme leverage, taking risks that, frankly, no ordinary business could or would even contemplate. Hashtag ABA leverage and the LBO titans. And you really can't talk about modern finance without talking about the rise of private equity and the LBO, the leveraged buyout. It completely changed the game in corporate control. And the sheer scale of these deals just exploded, mostly because the whole thing was fueled by incredibly cheap debt.
Okay, just quickly for listeners, an LBO, that's basically buying a company using mostly borrowed money, right? The bet is the company itself can generate enough cash to pay back the loans.
That's the core idea, yeah. You put in a relatively small slice of your own money, the equity, and borrow the rest. The goal is to get a huge return on that small equity slice. But the amount of leverage, the sheer ratio of debt to equity, it just went to unprecedented levels. push right past traditional financial norms.
And the Clear Channel deal is highlighted as just a staggering example of this. Can you give us the numbers on that one? They sound wild.
They're almost unbelievable. The buyers put up only $4 billion of their own money, the equity, which sounds like a lot, but the total price, that $4 billion was just 16%.
16% equity.
Yeah, the sources call it a reed-thin equity base, a tiny sliver of actual skin in the game. And that sliver was supporting, now wait for it, $21.5 billion in debt, borrowed money.
21 billion. Supported by 4. How's that even possible? That sounds like it would collapse instantly.
It looked impossible on paper. It was only feasible because lenders, the banks, were willing to offer credit based on multiples that just defied normal business sense.
Yeah.
Specifically, 10 times the company's cash flow.
10 times cash flow in debt.
Yeah. Basically meaning the company would eat every penny of profit it generated for 10 years with nothing left for investment or growth, just to pay back the principal on the loan. Even major LBO players like Blackstone were saying publicly, no company can support that kind of debt. It just shows you the frenzy of cheap credit that was available in the mid-2000s.
But for banks to lend that kind of money, even with cheap credit, didn't that require some fundamental changes in how banking itself worked? You needed people willing to structure these massive deals.
Absolutely. You needed figures like Jimmy Lee, who rose through the ranks at places like Chemical Bank, Chase Manhattan, JP Morgan Chase. He became a kind of kingpin. Lee essentially did for bank lending what Michael Milken did for junk bonds in the 80s.
Okay, how so? What did he change?
Lee really pioneered and perfected the modern syndicated loan market. Instead of one bank taking on the entire massive risk of a huge loan, like that $21.5 billion for Clear Channel.
Which would be terrifying for one bank.
Right. He structured it so the loan was shared among a large group, a syndicate of many banks. Each bank took a smaller piece of the overall risk. This syndication allowed banks collectively to assemble these multi-billion-dollar loan packages far bigger than any single institution could handle alone. It was absolutely critical to fueling the massive growth in LBOs globally.
Now, when you have this much money and power sloshing around, it often seems like illegality and manipulation aren't far behind. The late 80s, with the whole Drexel Burnham Lambert collapse and the insider trading scandals, really brought this into the open, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sources talk about this palpable dread of exposure spreading across Wall Street. It really started snowballing with the arrest of Dennis Levine, a big M&A banker at Drexel.
What was he accused of?
A massive insider trading scheme, making something like $12.6 million in illegal profits based on confidential deal information. And crucially, Levine started cooperating with prosecutors.
Which led them up the chain.
Straight up the chain. His cooperation was the key that unlocked the case against Ivan Boyeski, the arbitrager who became the face of 80s greed.
Boteski, right. His name became synonymous with it all.
Instantly. When he pleaded guilty, it was huge news. He became, as the sources put it, overnight, a national symbol of greed. It shifted the public perception. Suddenly, high finance didn't just seem complex. It seemed potentially rotten at the core.
And fast forward to today, that instinct for self-preservation, especially avoiding leaving evidence, it seems unchanged. High-stakes players still understand the danger of a paper trail.
Yeah, that tactic seems timeless. We see it documented explicitly in the Theranos saga. Don Lucas, who was a key figure on their board, apparently made it a strict policy. No email.
No email at all.
He actively avoided it because, quoting the source, he didn't like the idea of leaving behind an electronic paper trail that might one day be used against him in court. That's not just being cautious. It's a calculated strategy used by people who anticipate scrutiny and know how damaging documented evidence can be.
But the manipulation isn't always about secret deals or deleting emails, right? Sometimes it's baked right into the system itself. The LIBOR scandal is just mind-blowing.
LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. Yeah, that might be the most shocking example of a flawed system just begging to be exploited. This rate affects trillions of dollars in financial contracts worldwide. Mortgages, corporate loans, derivatives, everything.
And yet it was easy to manipulate. How?
The vulnerability was almost laughably simple. Institutional neglect. Back in the 90s and even later, the actual process of submitting a bank's borrowing rate, the number used to calculate LIBOR, was often handled by very junior employees.
Junior staff were setting a global benchmark rate.
Effectively, yes. They'd just call in their bank's number each morning to the agency collecting the data. And the crucial part, almost no senior oversight, no checks, little accountability. And because the calculation often dropped the highest and lowest submissions, All a major bank needed to do to nudge the average rate was to slightly shade its own submission up or down. That tiny change would ripple through the average used globally.
So a trader could basically just tell the junior person submitting the rate, hey, nudge it up a bit today if it helped their trading position.
That's pretty much what happened. The incentive could be huge. If a trader had a massive derivatives position tied to where LIBOR settled that day, influencing their bank's submission even by a tiny fraction of percent could mean millions in profit or loss.
Wow.
There's this great revealing anecdote of the sources. One trader is trying to manipulate the rate, and a colleague tells him to double the already massive dollar figure he was basing his submission on.
Double.
Yeah. And the trader's internal reaction was apparently, Christ, Sasha, you're mental. He knew it was nuts, probably illegal, definitely risky, but it was an order, and the system's flaws were kind of an open secret. So he did it. It just shows how easily the system could be gamed, almost casually, by those who understood how broken it was. And sometimes, these corporate battles, they stop being about spreadsheets and strategy pretty quickly. They become intensely personal slugfests. Ego, betrayal, resentment, it all comes out.
The fight for RJR Nabisco, the tobacco and food giant, that's like the ultimate example of this, right? Billions on the line, and it got incredibly nasty.
Oh, it was epic. Ross Johnson, who was the CEO of RJR, he took the initial low stock price really personally. He felt the market was giving him a bad report card, especially when he saw other food company stocks soaring. He felt like, his words, a wallflower at the orgy. That personal slight was part of what fueled his drive to take the company private in the first place.
And then when the bidding war started, especially with KKR coming in, the structure of the deal itself became a weapon.
Absolutely. Johnson's initial management buyout offer was structured as part cash, part securities basically, debt instruments, junk bonds. The rival bidding team, led by Peter Cohen at Shearson Lehman, they seized on that. They made a big public show of countering with more cash, painting Johnson's paper deal as inferior, even though they ended up using plenty of their own paper later. In these huge fights, every detail becomes ammunition in what's fundamentally a war of egos for control.
And when those egos clash, things can get really raw. There's that famous confrontation described in the sources.
Yeah, all pretense of politeness just vanished. At one critical point, Ross Johnson's team felt totally betrayed by a move made by a Morgan Stanley banker involved in the deal. Linda Robinson, who was the wife of a key executive on Johnson's side, apparently delivered this absolutely brutal parting shot directly to the banker, Jeff Gleacher. She just said, "Gleacher, you're a fucking liar."
Oh.
Yeah. It perfectly captures that moment where the stakes are so high, the pressure's so intense, that the professional veneer just shatters completely. It becomes pure personal venom.
Okay, so we've looked at the architecture of audacity in tech, in finance. Now, what does it all mean for the rest of us, for society? This final part, let's dig into how the powerful interact with the world around them, maybe through philanthropy that serves their interests, maybe political manipulation, or sometimes just outright deception to hide the real cost of their power. #A, the moral conscience and concentration of capital.
Let's start with that moral dimension. It's actually striking that even the Gilded Age tycoons, the robber barons, felt some external heat about their wealth and how they got it. Andrew Carnegie, for instance, the steel magnate, he was apparently deeply affected by criticism from William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister.
Gladstone really went after the American millionaires, didn't he? What was his main criticism?
He didn't hold back. He basically called them out, saying that the desire to hoard is the lowest form of intellectual degradation. He framed accumulating massive wealth, just for its own sake, as fundamentally immoral, almost pathetic.
And Carnegie took that to heart.
Apparently so. The sources say he made this startling confession soon after, claiming he basically wouldn't try to make, or rather save another dollar after that point. He pivoted towards massive philanthropy, arguably to avoid that moral degradation Gladstone described. That criticism really shaped his public legacy.
But despite that kind of historical soul-searching, if you look at the big picture, the overall concentration of wealth hasn't really changed that much over the long haul, has it?
Sadly, no. When you look at the economic data, like the work Thomas Piketty has done, you see this persistent failure, really, to get back to the more equitable distribution of wealth we saw briefly in the mid-20th century.
Where are we now, comparatively?
Well, today, in highly unequal societies like the U.S., the top 10% captures around 50% of the national income. That level of concentration. It's scarily similar to what you saw in places like France and Britain before the French Revolution, during the Ancien Regime, or during the Belle Epoque before World War I, centuries ago. The underlying patterns of capital accumulation seem incredibly resistant to just moral arguments.
And you contrast Carnegie's eventual, maybe guilt-driven philanthropy with someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt. The sources paint him as the first real icon of ruthless American corporate power.
Vanderbilt is a master. He understood the instruments of finance and the corporation purely as tools to amass power, and he used them incredibly effectively, contributing directly to this growing divide in American society. He didn't see the corporation as having any public obligation. It was simply an extension of his will.
What specific tools did he pioneer or master?
He was brilliant at using things like holding companies, aggressive stock manipulation, often to consolidate railroads, shipping lines, creating monopolies. His ruthlessness was legendary.
Yeah.
Famously, he relied more on his sons-in-law than his own sons, who he found disappointing. Competence and loyalty mattered more than blood. And he took extreme actions, like firing an official just for giving $20,000 in gold to William Walker, that infamous adventure, because Vanderbilt saw it purely as a waste of capital. Even late in life, in his 80s, the Commodore was still borrowing huge sums, like $20 million, just to execute specific stock trades, always focused on maintaining absolute control and crushing perceived enemies, no matter the cost. #B, manufacturing consent and controlling the narrative. And that control, it isn't just about owning the assets or manipulating the market. It's critically about controlling the story, controlling public perception. And that's something the powerful have arguably gotten even better at over time.
We see examples of this manufacturing consent across different scandals, even very recently.
Oh, absolutely. The Theranos story is a perfect example. While you had Don Lucas meticulously avoiding emails to prevent a paper trail, Elizabeth Holmes and the company were masters of external spin. When actual reporting started to surface about inaccurate test results, what did they do? They dismissed it all as just a few isolated cases. They created this smokescreen, as the sources put it, to counter factual reporting, managing the narrative even when the reality was failure.
And the pharmaceutical industry, particularly with painkillers like OxyContin, used incredibly sophisticated methods to shape the narrative around addiction, didn't they?
Devastatingly effective methods. Purdue Pharma desperately wanted to market OxyContin as non-addictive, or at least much less addictive than older opioids. So what did they latch onto? A 5-sentence letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine.
A letter, not even a study.
Not a peer-reviewed study, no. Just a brief note based on monitoring patients in a hospital for a short time. But Purdue took that letter and basically used it as an ad, promoting it heavily to doctors to claim that addiction was rare with OxyContin.
But the sources point out the real driver of addiction wasn't just that claim, it was something structural about the dosage.
That's the really insidious part. Purdue's key marketing angle was the 12-hour dosage. Take one pill, get relief all day, sleep through the night. Sounds great, right?
Yeah.
Except for many, many patients, the drug actually wore off after about 8 hours. So what happens then? Sudden, intense withdrawal symptoms kick in: pain, anxiety, craving. But the patients, and often their doctors, didn't recognize it as withdrawal. They thought it was just their original pain coming back worse than ever.
Meaning they thought they needed more of the drug sooner?
Exactly. So the very thing marketed as a benefit, the 12-hour duration, actually created this cycle of withdrawal and craving that drove dependence and addiction. It was essentially an addiction recipe baked into the product's core marketing claim, fueling massive sales based on misleading information.
And this idea of shaping perception through presentation, it goes way back. Robert Moses, the New York City power broker, was doing this visually long before PowerPoint.
Moses was a genius at using the appearance of progress to consolidate his own power and grab resources. He'd use these carefully crafted maps of New York City, one from 1933, one from 1937, showing all the new playgrounds his department had built as little dots.
Creating this visual impression of huge improvement.
Exactly, an image of unqualified improvement, making him look like the indispensable builder. But what was that spectacle really hiding?
What was it hiding?
It masked the fact that his parks department was grabbing a wholly disproportionate share of city-owned land in the process. He moved so fast, justified by these public works, that other city agencies couldn't even react to stop his land grabs. The positive PR, the maps, it all manufactured the public and political consent he needed to maintain his iron grip on the city's development for decades. #C, political and bureaucratic leverage. Which brings us to the ultimate form of power, maybe. Political and bureaucratic leverage, the ability to actually shape or control the state itself, make the government work for you.
And the sources mention this Asian Godfathers model, where wealth is built by exploiting weaknesses in the political system.
Yeah, these are powerful figures who often get rich by exploiting political inefficiencies, bureaucratic loopholes, basically through rent-seeking, extracting value without necessarily creating it. The sources draw an important distinction. While these tycoons might benefit hugely from overall regional growth, their own contribution to productivity gains often lags behind.
So they're riding the wave, not necessarily creating it.
In many cases, yes. For example, one study in Thailand found that actual productivity growth was much higher in sectors like agriculture and manufacturing than it was in the service industries, banking, real estate, telecom, that these tycoons typically dominated.
Yeah.
Their fortunes came more from manipulating the system
Yeah.
than from optimizing output within it.
We see the different flavor of state manipulation in modern Russia, right? More centralized, using the state apparatus very directly against rivals.
Absolutely. Putin's consolidation of power involved very deliberately targeting specific oligarchs he saw as political threats, most famously Mikhail Khodorkovsky. This wasn't really about economics. It was a political power play.
And it worked politically.
It worked incredibly well because, crucially, attacking a billionaire oligarch was immensely popular with ordinary Russians. Most Russians hadn't benefited from the chaotic privatization in the 90s. They resented the instant fortunes made, often corruptly. So taking down an oligarch sent a powerful message. The state and its bureaucracy was now firmly under Putin's control and responsive only to him.
And then there's the extreme end. Billionaires who become so obsessed with control, they try to basically buy or capture entire governments in smaller regions.
That's the bizarre story of Howard Hughes.
Yeah.
His obsession with absolute dictatorial control became all-consuming. It actually contributed to major business failures, like how he ran RKO movie studios into the ground. When he started looking for new places to operate, like Nevada or the Bahamas, he wasn't just looking for low taxes. He literally instructed an aide to, quote, wrap that government up down there to a point where it would be, well, a captive entity in every way.
A captive entity? What did he want that for?
He believed that in smaller places with less diverse economies, he could achieve total control, operate with zero friction. He wanted the power to do anything, stop a school integration plan he didn't like, get a doctor licensed without the usual exams. For Hughes, complete political control wasn't just a perk. It was the ultimate form of business security, the ultimate insulation from any external constraints. Hashtag out of Paltrow.
Wow. What an incredible journey through this landscape of power. It's often uncomfortable, isn't it? From AI monopolies defining efficiency today, right back to these age-old tactics of controlling governments, controlling the story.
Yeah, and across all these different eras and sectors, Vanderbilt using corporate structures, Gates fighting for software standards, the LBO guys using massive debt, the LIBOR traders gaming the system, politicians leveraging popular resentment. You really do see these same core impulses.
What are they, boiled down?
It seems to be this willingness to embrace absolutely staggering risk, a desire to leverage every available resource, especially debt, way beyond normal limits, and this deep, almost instinctual understanding that controlling the narrative, controlling information flow is just as vital as controlling the actual capital.
The sources really show that whether you're, carefully avoiding emails in Silicon Valley today or Vanderbilt was manipulating railroad stocks 150 years ago, the biggest plays often happen right at the edge. Pushing the limits of the rules, being willing to accept huge short-term costs or inefficiencies if the long-term prize is total dominance, market dominance, political dominance.
And think about this. We see these magazines publishing their rich lists every year, right?
Yeah.
The Forbes 400, the billionaire rankings. It gives us this feeling, this illusion maybe of transparency. We think we know who have the wealth.
Right.
But when you consider the sheer opacity of so many private deals, when you think about powerful figures deliberately destroying potential paper trails like Don Lucas did, when you consider the calculated ethical risks, the quiet manipulations baked into systems like LIBOR was, you have to ask, are these public rankings really showing us the full picture? Are they a genuine measure of success? Or are they perhaps just a kind of carefully curated sideshow? A distraction from where the real battles for wealth and power, the hidden ones, the undocumented ones, are actually being fought.
Something to definitely think about. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Join us next time.